Good afternoon and welcome to this afternoon session as we look towards an inclusive crisis response and the global approaches to how we can actually have that happen. My name is Judith Allen, and we're going to introduce our panelists real quick. And they're going to be able to share with you some of their understanding and some of the work that they've done around inclusivity in response to what we're seeing happening around the world. Julius L. Jones, he is the assistant curator at Chicago History Museum. Christopher Hawthorne. Christopher is the chief design officer for the city of Los Angeles. Eugenia Concha, design director at El Quipo Manzanti in Colombia. Tatiana Bilbao is the principal at Tatiana Bilbao Estudio in Mexico City. We have Kai Bergman, who's the partner at Bjark Ingels Group in New York City. And then we have Bruce Mao, who's the co-founder and chief executive officer of Massive Change Network here in Chicago. Welcome, all of you. Great. So we're going to talk a little bit about ourselves. So I'm going to talk a little bit about who I am. I'm Dr. Judith Allen. I am the Chief Operating Officer for Communities and Schools of Chicago. We are an educational nonprofit. I have spent the last 20 years working in the area of public service, from law enforcement to social services. I got to experience several things that kind of brought me to being in front of you great people today. That's inclusive of experiencing pre and post 9/11 urban responses in the city. After that, I found myself in Dallas a few months before Katrina hit New Orleans, and the city saw a rapid influx of children and families from New Orleans with nothing but the clothes on their backs. And what that was able to do was personify for many in Dallas the meaning of the word refugee and how a city is able to embrace itself and wrap itself around those in need. And now here I am in Chicago, and our city is adapting to this extended period of uncertainty and unrest under this COVID dome, threatening our ability to resolve ourselves around what defines Chicago. The food, the music, the people. The city of big shoulders is tired. My current work with CIS is part of a larger national organization with the sole purpose of creating pathways of equity in education for every child. We provide direct clinical and social services to 175 Chicago public schools students, focusing on 59,000 students and families. While we see that safe housing, access to health, preventive care, and a productive educational space was a challenge before March 2020, we're now entering into a defining moment where we really have to take a look at the gap between the haves and the have-nots, which is threatening to swallow families whole. So we're looking at the CIS neighborhoods and how schools and the buildings are being redefined, because the schools, as we know, are a valuable ecosystem that foster character, community, and consistency for children. Without that space, those benefits and that sanctuary is gone for so many left to their own devices, not just academically, but socially, emotionally, and developmentally. So I'm going to pass this on to Julius to tell us a little bit about himself and what he's been up to.
Thank you, Judith. My name is Julius Jones. Again, I'm an assistant curator at the Chicago History Museum, and I also happen to be a PhD candidate in U.S. history at the University of Chicago. And so for me, my sort of perspective to this is really the historical one. And so we are hard at work at an exhibit to commemorate the sesquicentennial of the Great Chicago Fire of 1871. And in our sort of telling of the story, what we really want to focus on is how in managing the recovery from that disaster, you see a city that grapples with its long-standing inequalities and actually decides more or less to double down on those inequalities. And so instead of using the recovery from the fire as an opportunity to create a more inclusive, a more diverse, a more equitable city, instead they sort of used the recovery to reestablish the pre-disaster social order. And that was a social order, that was rife with divisions between the have and have-nots, nativist and anti-immigrant sentiments. You may all be familiar with the myth of Catherine O'Leary and her cow starting the fire. Well, that myth is sort of born out of the anti-immigrant and nativist sentiment that existed in Chicago during the period in question. So all of these things become sort of the filter through which the recovery efforts are managed. And so you have a private charitable organization, the Chicago Relief and Aid Society, led by the city's prominent businessmen, and they sort of go about managing the recovery to ensure that people who have, who had, and those who had not before the fire, do not use the fire as an opportunity to, heaven forbid, better themselves or their lot in life in any way. Additionally, they used a very clear filter to sort of say, you are going to have to sort of conduct yourself and work in order to earn your keep, and we are going to be the determiners of that. So I think when we think about that historical example, it's a classic case study of what not to do, and I think there are lessons that we can learn and in terms of how not to apply them to future post-crisis moments like the one we hope to find ourselves in when the COVID-19 pandemic subsides.
Thank you, Julius. Christopher, let's hear from you.
Thank you so much, Judith. Hello, everybody. It's a real pleasure to be here, and I will try to keep this brief. I really hope the conversation that follows will be where we can spend most of our time. I'm the Chief Design Officer for the City of Los Angeles. I was appointed to that position by Mayor Eric Garcetti about 2.5 years ago in early 2018. And for about 13 or 14 years before that, I was the architecture critic at the Los Angeles Times. At the beginning of this year, of course, we saw the beginning of a public health crisis, which led to an economic crisis. And then we saw the unfolding of really a racial justice reckoning in Los Angeles, as in so many other cities around the country after the murder of George Floyd. And of course, we began the year with a planetary crisis, with a climate change crisis confronting us. So most of my City Hall colleagues, my mayor's office colleagues, this has certainly been true for my work, we have been having to balance our long-term initiatives, ongoing projects with crisis response, really in dealing with this unprecedented year and these overlapping crises. One point I will make before I talk briefly about a couple of initiatives that I've been working on is that we do not have the luxury in Los Angeles, as is true in so many other places in the world, of thinking of a post-COVID future in a kind of vacuum. We are very much still in the thick of COVID. We are looking at a very significant surge across Southern California and California as a whole over the next month or so as we head into the holidays. So we are very much still working vigilantly and being on guard in thinking about what our response means. In terms of specific COVID response, that has meant trying to open up our streets to pedestrians and cyclists and slow them down to car access through a program called Slow Streets. It has meant an alfresco outdoor dining program that is now being expanded beyond just restaurants to other businesses that are taking advantage of being in outdoor space. But I want to mention a couple of ongoing projects too that touch on these questions of equity and help us imagine how we might respond to this really overdue reckoning that has touched so many institutions, including city government this year. One, Julius mentioned myths and history. About a year ago, I convened a Mayor's Office Civic Memory Working Group, which has now grown to about 50 leading historians, architects, designers, artists, activists, and others who are helping us imagine ways to reconnect with the history of the city. And we will issue a report by the end of this year with support from the Getty Foundation. We've just launched a low-rise housing design challenge today, as a matter of fact, and you can find information about that at lowrise.la. That's LOWRISE.LA, looking for new models of low-rise multi-unit housing across Los Angeles. And in December, I'll be bringing together a group for a symposium called Pump to Plug with USC and some other partners, looking at the future of gas station sites and charging stations, with equity and environmental justice really at the heart of that question. So memory, housing, mobility, these are three major building blocks in how we think of and how we conceive of Los Angeles. And we have launched initiatives to try to move the conversation forward in all three of those categories. Thanks so much.
Great, thank you, Christopher. Eugenia.
Hi, it's an honor to be here. I'm a Spanish architect based in Bogota with 12 years of international experience in architecture and urban design. I live in Spain, in India, in Bolivia, in Sweden, in Uruguay, and in Colombia. For the past 7 years, I have been the head of design of El Equipo Mazzanti. And I'm very interested in city construction, social transformation, public space, management, and project development in multidisciplinary teams in different social and geographical contexts. My practice places social values at its core, and such revolves around projects that facilitate urban transformation and build community. And I truly believe in the power of a space to build democratic relationships and to solve any kind of crisis we face off. So here we are to face the one we are having right now. Thanks.
Thank you, Eugenia. Tatiana.
Yes, hello. Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here with you all, and also looking forward to this interesting conversation. My name is Tatiana Bilbao. I'm the head of Tatiana Bilbao Studio. I lead this office that was founded 16 years ago. And in the core of my work, it's an architectural office. In the core of my work is trying to understand how architecture could really be placed in solving the basic necessity of human being, which is having a refugee, a place to build ourselves. And I have been working in all the spectrum of the word domestic space, basically focusing a lot on how to really bring the possibility of having a place, a home, to those that really have very few other opportunities of having spaces that will endure and enhance their lives. I really think that this pandemic has at least one of the things that I believe that has universally teaches is that a house is not only a set of walls, that a house is a place that needs to be able to allow you to develop our most endurance habits. It is not a product. It cannot be a commodity. It cannot be a box with compartments labeled, because really that really doesn't allow us to fulfill our necessities. I hope that we can understand that for the future, what I've been saying through all my career is that the house needs to be, first of all, erased on the concept that we have today, and really thought as the core basic structure, both physically and socially, that a human being needs to develop their own life. A home needs to provide humans with tools to fulfill their most basic necessities. No, we need to be nurtured, and we need to be to have a refugee on top of our head, to be able to be healthy, to develop our lives. So a home is the best hospital, and we can really know it very literally by now. The home is the best school, is the best place where you can learn things. And most importantly, a home needs to be able to be the structure that holds you individually, to be able to build yourself, build your identity, and be able then, therefore, to relate with the other. And thank you. I'm very happy to discuss these issues with you today.
Thank you, Tatiana. Kai Uwe.
Sure. Thank you for this opportunity. I think, as was stated before, that these times that have sort of shocked systems, both in the past as well as they do currently with COVID, are also opportunities to actually think about how we can improve both systems and social structures, so that we deal with actually the issues and the challenges that are so evident. In the past, we've had pandemics, and previously sort of cholera has certainly looked at how we could actually look at our sewer systems in cities and elsewhere. We've had overcrowding in our cities that here in New York, Lower Manhattan has led to actually rethinking about the sort of urban parks, the urban refuges that we needed to actually make sure that we could get through the day. World War II certainly also led to thinking about infrastructure here in America with the federal highway system. 9/11 to thinking and rethinking about our security within the public realm. And even, here more recently in New York, Sandy certainly looked at how we looked at flood protection and our coastal regions in the city. So we do feel that COVID in many ways can certainly address issues of the public realm. And as Christopher's also mentioned, how we actually think about sidewalks and the spaces that we all use every single day. So we are looking at sort of the city at large, the 5 boroughs, and seeing how the systems that we had before of moving people through roadways, a grid, the New York grid, could actually start to prioritize pedestrians and bicyclists and give them safe spaces. So rethinking the grid in sort of a woven pattern of pedestrians versus sort of e-scooters and strollers versus sort of vehicles, and looking at how that could actually start to re-knit and provide a more egalitarian space throughout the city. And specifically on projects, rethinking the BQE of being a much more kind of integrated infrastructure, a social infrastructure in the city. And 2 projects that we've been working on since COVID, reimagining the Brooklyn Bridge as actually prioritizing the pedestrian and bicycle experience over that of vehicles, and also downtown Brooklyn, of when you're considering making the urban realm of really widening the sidewalks and providing spaces, very similar to the work that we were doing in Copenhagen with Superkilen. Looking forward to seeing how all of these conversations weave together in the next little while. Thank you.
Thank you, Kai. And Bruce.
Thank you, Judith. Really honored to be here. Incredible group of people. I am a designer and have had a practice for 35 years or so. I started as a graphic designer at a time when the world was becoming transparent, so that everything that you do is now part of your story and part of what you communicate. That meant for me, it was that my work went from graphic design to what I now call life-centered design, really enterprise-wide, thinking about holistically designing the outcomes that we want. Most recently, I published a book called MC24, and that book really was a kind of culmination of that process to try to understand how do we think this way? How do we work and think this way? and begin to develop the tools to design at a ecosystem scale and really design the outcomes that we want. What we realized was that we are really living through a crisis of caring. If you think about the kind of pandemic and the other challenges that we've just been describing, what they have in common is a challenge in empathy, to really understand the experience of someone else or something else, and really begin to bring a kind of empathic, holistic, life-centered approach. I am very honored and fortunate to be on the board of a new architecture school in Northern Canada, in my hometown of Sudbury. And that school is a tri-cultural project with French, English, and Indigenous leaders. I've been going up there and working with folks there for the last few years. And what I discover really is a kind of worldview or cosmology that I've been searching for and developing independently. And that is the worldview that puts life at the center and not humans. A way of thinking that honors and respects life. And we come to that, we come to honor life along with all the other living creatures, and we share that experience and really don't put ourselves at the center. It's not a kind of narcissistic worldview. And when I realized that that's really the way that I've been working towards, I've been trying to get to a way of thinking and a way of thinking about cities in particular that doesn't put humans at the center, but really puts the natural world at the center and allows us to reimagine the way that we live in cities as part of the natural world. I think when you start to apply the principles of MC24 and really think about cities in this new way, it really demands a whole new way of working and living.
Thank you, Bruce. Okay, so we're going to do a little have a little conversation now with our panel around some of the things that we've talked about, and we've heard some reoccurring themes with this brilliant group that we have in front of us. We've heard empathy, we've heard health, we've heard about refuge, which is a good concept to think about where we are now, opportunity, intention, reckoning, memory, and global centric, really key aspects to how we think about design, how we think about space, how we think about living. So what I would love to do is to open this up, and I'm going to throw this out to any one of you, and anyone can jump in, please do. But our first question is really around, oh, and by the way, if anyone would like to ask questions of anyone on this panel, please use your Zoom Q&A button at the bottom of your screen to submit questions there, and then I will field those for you. All right, so we'd like to start with the concept of where we are right now. Chicago just released, the governor was just on television talking about how we're stepping back into phase 3 now because of that growing number of COVID numbers. So in what ways, and I'm going to start with you, Bruce. In what ways have civic responses to the pandemic been most successful? So in other words, how are we doing things right in terms of our city, in terms of the space, and how we're using it?
Well, I think there are a couple of things that that I've seen that really, to me, kind of speak the right language. I think wherever we are expressing our collective well-being and really communicating the idea that your behavior, your conduct is part of our collective well-being, and able to kind of get that message across, I think we've seen the greatest success. From a kind of urbanistic perspective, I think the work of David Rockwell in New York, of really exploring what does it mean to not simply to kind of allow restaurants to be outside, but to actually design that experience so that it becomes a kind of beautiful part of the city, and really start to integrate beauty into our response. because I think so much of the response to the pandemic has been defined and articulated in the negative. Whereas I think, I mean, for me, the challenge, the design challenge, is really to kind of flip that into an opportunity and to see it as an opportunity. I think one of the biggest gifts of the pandemic is that it has allowed us to see that we can change things that we thought we could never change. And I think that's a huge opportunity for us.
Thank you, Bruce. Thank you. I think you are a change, or your focus, your specialty is change. And if anyone can see behind Bruce, the book that he referenced is sitting behind him, and that is really about massive change and being able to conduct that in a healthy, intentional way. We're going to popcorn that a little bit. I'm going to take this to you, Christopher, in talking about Los Angeles. Now, one of the projects that you mentioned that you're working on is something around sort of the strategy and the history around Los Angeles and how the design has been put together. And you had mentioned something about, and may have not been this conversation, maybe in previous, but about civic memory, right? And about how we learn from what we've done right and what we've done wrong. So can you tell us a little bit about that group in terms of design strategies around memory for a city?
Absolutely. So this is a group, the Mayor's Office Civic Memory Group, that I convened for the first time in November of last year. And to a certain extent, that was connected to the ongoing conversation nationally about the fate of controversial monuments and memorials, particularly Confederate monuments and memorials. But from the beginning, we wanted to ground our effort in the specific history of Los Angeles and in our particular, and in some ways peculiar, relationship with the past and with the broader notion of civic memory. And when I say peculiar, what I mean by that is that Los Angeles has long thought of itself, and we have, to a certain extent, been proud of thinking of ourselves as a city of the future, a place of continual reinvention, a place where reinvention is possible, both for individuals and for institutions and for the broader civic identity, I would say. And of course, that has a lot to do with the presence of Hollywood here and the idea that this has been a place that attracted people because they wanted to be in a place of reinvention, or a place that didn't have the weight of history bearing down quite so heavily as might be the case in an East Coast American city. But in terms of our relationship with our past, that meant that we became more aggressive than most cities in erasing or whitewashing or bearing our history when it was difficult, when it was uncomfortable, when, I think most to the point, when it didn't match our own myths and myth making. So Julius mentioned myths earlier, and this has been a city that has been quite aggressive in its myth making and its boosterism and selling a particular idea of what Los Angeles means to the rest of the world, of course, often using Hollywood and other mechanisms of mass media to do that. So what we wanted to do is to bring together a group of historians, community activists, architects, artists, designers, scholars, to help us think through this question, particularly in our public design work. How can we produce work that is more honestly grounded in a connection to the past, to a connection to civic memory? And it began actually with some conversations I had with the mayor about the 1871 anti-Chinese massacre, which happened in what was then Chinatown, just north of downtown Los Angeles. It remains one of the worst episodes of racial violence in California history, and yet we never really grappled with it as a city. Similarly, we've never grappled with internment as a city. We've never grappled with the forced repatriation of hundreds of thousands of Mexican immigrants and Mexican Americans that happened in the 1930s, for example. So thanks to support from the Getty Foundation, we will be issuing a set of policy recommendations and a broader report, which will take the form of a website and a printed volume, both designed by a really talented LA design firm called Polymode, which will be finished before the end of the year. And this will be something of a hybrid. It will be, again, both some very specific policy recommendations should the city, for example, adopt an Indigenous land acknowledgement policy. Was very interested, of course, to hear what Bruce was saying about the architecture school where he's working. And we've been consulting with a number of Indigenous and tribal leaders and elders in Southern California on that question. How can we going forward with the policy questions. How can we strengthen the protection of residential architecture? Questions like that, but then also embedding those policy recommendations within a broader editorial package, which will include photo essays, interviews, roundtable discussions on questions like, on topics like the constructions of whiteness in Los Angeles, the legacy and meaning of Father Junipero Serra, who is a controversial figure. His statues are sort of our version of Confederate statues. Some of them have been taken down this year. And so we will finish this work by the end of the year. And it has been a truly remarkable initiative to learn from all of these colleagues who come to this group from a whole variety of backgrounds.
Thank you so much, Christopher. It sounds like it's a Herculean task to be able to move all of those pieces. We actually have a question here from our audience around the investment strategies and what that's going to look like, because we're talking about all of these sort of strategies and how we can possibly move that, but there's going to be a huge investment, right? That's going to take to get this to move a little bit. And I'd like to toss this over to you, Kai. So the question is, can we please comment on how we as designers and citizens can influence public officials to invest in this important improvement to our healthy ways of living?
Sure. And I think it's a question of collective over individuals. The Sandy actually really presented, when the city floods, it floods everything, streets, buildings. It's very sort of inclusive in that way. And now in the aftermath of Sandy, insurance companies do not approach the investment of flood protection as a collective citywide kind of issue. They view it as every single building or plot is basically a single investment. And each building is in a way protecting itself against flooding in the future. But imagine that you now are protecting every single building plot in all of Lower Manhattan individually and not collectively. That means that the streets may still flood. You may have a dry building, but you will not actually go to work. And if you live in that building, you're not going to be able to move around or do anything. So it's actually, in a way, a very sort of backward approach to dealing with large scale infrastructural kind of change. And I think that that's where we kind of have to collectively work together. The government, policy, the sort of individual interested stakeholders, in this case also designers, to change the conversation to let us consider the systemic changes that need to occur, and then also approach those investments collectively as a city, as a region, and then even as a neighborhood, if you want to go down to a smaller unit. It is at that level that I think we're talking about the kind of public sector, public realm changes that would really, really benefit us in the aftermath of the time that we're in.
Thank you, Kai. I hope that answers your question. And I mean, we can go on with that for a very long time. I have a question actually here for Eugenia around the concepts of public space. You've been just about everywhere, right? And so we want to gain some perspective on how we can create more, and we're using this term very loosely, but creatively, inclusivity to different types of uses for public space. So how can we take public space and make it something that is inviting to all, to everyone that's part of that community, part of that ecosystem, especially in times like this when, people need to be able to get out but feel safe. So if you can tell some dynamics around that and what you've seen historically.
In fact, when Tatiana shows her approach to the domestic space and homes, I was thinking that I'm living alone here in Colombia. My family and most friends are in Spain. and my house became like a kind of Stockholm syndrome. I didn't want to go out, and once I really like push myself to go out, I realized I need a public space to be with people. I really need a human contact, or at least to see people. So I realized the importance of public space as an extension of our homes, especially in these pandemic times. So I think to make public space more secure places and inclusive, I think the point here would be to have diversity in the design process, where public policies could guarantee that the design groups are based on diversity and not only on white hegemony, because design process, there is has to be an active participation where everybody has an opinion and we can learn from everybody. So I think this is the way we can change these places to be safe and inclusive to everybody.
Thank you, Eugenia. That's a great response. And it really kind of piggybacks on, let's see, what Christopher has said, what Bruce has brought up about Indigenous populations and working with those groups to make sure that there is a voice, right? Because we know there's a huge difference between equity and equality. So we want to make sure that everybody has a seat at the table. So thank you, Eugenia, for pinging that about Tatiana, because I want to talk about home space, because a lot of us have actually accidentally, I guess, opened up our homes, right, in this last 7 months. Now everyone gets to see where you live, and you're on Zoom calls and you're kind of looking and, you know, hey, what's that bookcase back there? So so let's talk about the home space, right? I want to talk to Tatiana, if you can help us kind of understand when we talk about refuge and habitat and urban dwellings. We've seen a lot of the cities, when they look to shut down or have us stand down to create that sense of safety, the essential workers, right? They're still having to go out there and go to work. So what can we do to create a sort of uniformity around safety for individuals in terms of their home? So we have some individuals that may not be able to stay home, right? But how can we look at, like you said, redefining what that house looks like, getting rid of the labels? What does that look like for you?
Well, I think first of all, in our case, in my context, they're not only the people that need to work in spaces where they have to, like, basic necessities that are not able to transform into Zoom formats. In our case, there's millions of people that don't have a house that becomes a refugee, as the rest of us. So that is the first response that as society we need to think that there are millions, and mostly probably the majority of the population has the lack of the possibility of having a house that protects the people. So they have to, they cannot be home to be protected. But well, on top, I think that the opportunities that the model that we're using right now gives to humans to develop their own lives are very small, are very limited. And I think that definitely that the configuration of putting everything, or every functional aspect of our lives in a box and individualizing it, compartmentalizing it, it's also creating difficulties, because we are not human beings that are able to be sorry, I was distracted because my little girl entered the room. But we're not able to be sustained by our own selves. We're not autosufficient. We need others to help to be able to feed us, to be able to nurture us, to be able to take care of us. And I agree with Bruce that we need to go back to the idea of putting care in a basic core. And the model of house that we have right now doesn't have that at all, because when you think that in that space only has, it's able to allow very few people, and they have to share your very intimate space in order to be there helping you with the everyday duties, or with your life, as Elena was saying, with this difficulty of having no contact, then this really becomes very problematic, and it really becomes very dangerous in this case of the pandemic. But if we think that if we can scale the set of spaces that would create a scale set of relationships, I think everything would be much more sustainable. If we were able to take care of ourselves, then we don't need basic workers to go around and travel millions of hours to be able to produce those things for us, that we are staying home and producing money to buy those things, you know? So not to put at risk people that will allow us to fulfill our own basic necessities. Other people to put our own basic necessities at stake. And I think what I mean is that we need to think that definitely human beings, we need a very intimate space that really allows us to restore our intimate self. As I always say it as in a reference of the monastery, no? Thinking that the first protective space and the first identification space is your clothes, and the second one is your cell, the cell of the monk. And then there is the link with the other members of the community through the cloister, that becomes this space where every space of interaction and of human care is linked to, no? So if we think that we are able to have all the other activities, no, being done in different scales of relationships with others in a space, I think we will become way more sustainable. So to put it in easier words, I would like to see the idea of really discarding the model of the box, to open it to create spaces that are going from the most intimate space as onions, as layers of spaces, to the most public ones. This will allow us to stage relationships that become more healthy, more sustainable, that allow us to take care and put care in the core, and that allow us to relate at the end with the collective, with the largest collective, in a more easy way, for else to say it, or at least to comprehend that relationship in an easier way.
That's great. Thank you so much, Tatiana. That makes a lot of sense. I like the reference to sort of those spatial relations and how they work off of each other. I think that's great. Julius, I have a question for you. We have talk about, so in this pandemic, we've seen sort of existing inequities that we develop a spotlight. I think when I spoke earlier, I spoke about education and how, you know, the city of Chicago really wrapped their brains around this whole thing about getting all kids laptops so they're able to connect. I went to a coffee shop where this began, and a coffee shop had closed its doors but opened up to students to be able to use their free Wi-Fi, right, to be able to go in there. So as we're talking about inequity and we're talking about creating a level playing field, what are your thoughts around interventions, and what are some of the things that we can do based on history, since you're studying the historical aspects of disaster in Chicago? But how can we take that and learn from this? What are some ideas that you have around what you've learned about the Chicago fire and how that can translate into real-world applications now?
Yeah, I think the key historical lesson that exists for us is not to sort of try to recreate the world as it existed immediately prior to the coronavirus, because I think, as everyone here pointed out, that world was fraught with some limitations and real challenges and issues. But can we use the recovery moment to think about building a more equitable, inclusive world? And I think there are so many historical examples from the fire where they did not take that opportunity, right? And so I was actually doing research just today, and one thing I found was that, you know, for people who had sort of been business owners, you sort of think about how much we sort of give to small business owners, right? So people who had been small business owners before the fire were sort of provided the means of which to recover and be allowed to sort of resume their small businesses. But if someone had a desire to be a small business owner, but just hadn't started their small business yet, they were denied access to those same resources. And that's an example of, could you imagine a world where, as we start thinking about jobs that have closed, many people have been furloughed, and whether or not those employment opportunities will ever come back on the scale in which they left, can we think about new economic opportunities that can exist for people, and can we provide people the resources to be able to access those opportunities, right? So instead of returning people back to their previous employment, positions, can we imagine a world where we actually use the post-COVID moment to think about new jobs and new economic opportunities and new ways of people to support themselves in ways we couldn't even imagine. I imagine jobs, Zoom or Skype assistant or helper, right? Something we might not have thought we needed. Someone who designs rooms to be Skype or Zoom friendly, so you can get a 10 out of 10 on Room Rater, right? All of these positions that we perhaps didn't imagine even existing, can this moment provide new opportunities for people, and not just sort of a desire to get back to the status quo as soon as possible?
Thank you. That's a great point. That the concept that everyone's trying to get away from saying those words, the new normal, right? Everybody hates that right now. So it's we don't want to talk about how we define normal anymore. But as we talk about that shift, that sort of dynamic pivot, it's another word that I'm tired of using. I want to kind of turn this to you, Bruce. I want to ask you this question, since you are our change guru, and I'm going to ask you to kind of be our design Nostradamus, if you would. So when we look at the things that will have to change, right? Because we know that some things will level off and we'll sort of slide back into old behaviors in terms of how we create space. But what do you foresee this pandemic, between the pandemic, global warming, politics, inclusivity, exclusivity, all of that, how do you see that creating a change in our design structures?
That's a great question. I think one of the things that could happen, let's say it's, I wouldn't hazard a prediction, but one of the things that could happen is a lot more inclusivity. That I think what happened technologically, culturally, is that we started using these kinds of tools that we're using right now. And what that means is that a lot more people can participate. If you have to fly somewhere to participate, that really limits who can be there. But if you are doing it this way, it opens up in a much broader way who can participate, who can be part of that conversation. And I think that is a really big opportunity for us to really make to put the conversation that's happening in this room into a lot more rooms. So that a lot more people are participating in the conversation about where we're going. Because I think that crisis of caring that I mentioned is kind of super polarizing, and you're getting groups pushed away from each other, not towards each other. You look at what happened demographically in the election, and you saw one big picture that became very clear is the cities against the countryside. That you saw the cities going one direction and the country going the other. And that is not sustainable. And in fact, I argue that there is only one city and we all live in it. Whether you're in a rural agricultural, natural environment. You're all part of our one global interconnected ecology. We all live in the one city that we are part of. And I think the more, we have an opportunity to really reach out and make those kinds of bridges, more attractive and more productive than they have been in the past.
Good. Thank you, Bruce. I'll hold you to that when I bump into you somewhere in the streets of Chicago when this is all over. So we have another question from the group, and I'm going to put this out to everyone because I think this is a great thing for us to kind of ponder on and chew on as a group here on this panel. So the question is around systemic change and how complex that can be. And we know that change is relatively easy. Now I'm speaking very loosely. Change is relatively easy, but is it sustainable, right? So the question is around, while our society is still processing the crisis, how can we keep our focus beyond the quick fixes and look towards the long-term innovations that we need, right? So this has gone beyond the new hotness. This is actually something that's going to reshape and redefine how we do just about everything. So how do we catalyze the energy that the public has right now, and what we need to do to imagine a post-crisis society? How do we keep this going? And anybody who's ready to answer, jump in.
I'm happy to jump
Thank
into
you.
the void. I would agree with Bruce and what others have said that that this crisis year really has unleashed a kind of communitarian spirit and a real an interest for all kinds of reasons in gathering together, whether that's to protest or to spend time outside. I'm so glad you asked the question about interior space earlier, and I so appreciated the comments from the other panelists, because and this is part of a larger answer to this question. I think the interior has been really under theorized in this crisis, has been under examined. We all have seen, of course, so many photographs that became emblematic of the pandemic, particularly early on, of empty public spaces. So Millennium Park in Chicago, empty. Champs-Élysées, Times Square, empty of people. When in fact, we have learned over time that it's outdoor spaces that are the safest places to be. And in fact, we're keeping those large public spaces closed largely as a public health measure to keep people from traveling to from one interior to another, right? And it's the interior that is both the space of danger and the place of refuge, as so many of the other panelists have already pointed out. And as such, it has an incredibly charged meaning right now, beyond just the question of the Zoom backdrop and sort of the version of ourselves that we transmit through the cameras on our computers. In another sense, it's the place where we're most at risk, and is the place that we are retreating to in order to hunker down and wait out the pandemic. And so I think there is a whole way in which we are, as others have pointed out, Tatiana, I think most extensively, there are all kinds of ways in which this should lead to very significant transformations in how the interior operates and how our ideas about domestic space operate. And I think that has everything to do with some very nuanced distinctions between, for example, overcrowding on the one hand and density on the other. There were a lot of takes early in the pandemic, a lot of op-eds that have not aged particularly well, saying that Los Angeles was doing better than New York, let's say, in the spring because we had room to spread out, and New York was suffering because of density. And then we, of course, got hit very hard, and we're getting hit hard again by this virus, despite our land use patterns. And what we found is that it's really overcrowding and unhealthy living conditions that this virus preys upon, and that well-designed density, look at Hong Kong, look at Taiwan, look at Seoul, look at Tokyo, these places have done quite well during the pandemic, despite being some of the densest places on Earth. So we need a housing policy in terms of systemic change that really thinks about these distinctions carefully. What is overcrowding on the one hand? What is productive density that builds community on the other? And what are the changes in sort of demand for, I think, another place where we're going to see really permanent change. I was suspicious that we would see any you know, having covered Katrina as you did and 9/11 as a journalist, I remember all the terrible predictions we made about the end of the skyscraper, et cetera, after 9/11, and so I was very reluctant to make too many predictions at the beginning. I do think we will see a decline in the demand for a particular kind of office space that is that will be long term, and that we have an opportunity in a city like Los Angeles, for example, to think about, and we already are having these conversations around policy, how to streamline the transition of office space to housing, and how to make that as easy and accessible as possible, how to turn those spaces into affordable units, how to put equity at the center of that and affordability at the center of those questions. So I think I would say taking advantage of the desire to use outdoor spaces in a new way together is something that, particularly in a city like Los Angeles, not known for the quality of its public space, will be permanent. And also these shifts in how we understand and build housing, residential space, and interiors is something that will be a long-term shift as well.
Good. Thank you, Christopher. Very eloquently put in terms of how we look at this long term. So we have it's like 3 minutes left of this, the last closing session. What I would like is for each one of you to give us a 1-sentence takeaway that you would like everyone who's watching and paying attention here, the one message that you really want them to hear as they click that off button shortly. I'll start with mine just to kind of kick that off. Integrate, talk to each other, and compare notes. That's my one message, is that I want to make sure that we're sharing with each other as often and as diligently as possible. That's my message. Anybody else?
Well, my one message would be that, you know, the past is context, but it's not destiny, right? Meaning that we can learn lessons from the past, or in positive and negative lessons that we can apply to our current situation. And I think one of the things that this moment teaches us is this sort of desire to get over something, right? It is sort of, you know, coming back to bite us in a lot of ways. Like we want to imagine a world where what we're experiencing is over, but I think the better way to think about it is how do we sort of conceptualize a world based on lessons that we've learned in the past, where we can sort of create a future that is not sort of now that this is over, but now that this is our sort of context, what have we learned from it, and what are we going to apply going forward?
Right. Good point. Thank you, Julius. That's the longest one sentence ever. Thank you. Anybody else like to share one sentence?
Yeah, I can follow up. I would like to really come out of this experience moving and understanding that we really need to put back in the core of our society, our most basic necessities, and understanding that we really need to transform the way we do everything and put back the notion of care of ourselves in the core of our society. And for me, that translates into the basic structure, as I said, the house, or erasing the notion of the block as a house.
Right. Thank you. We'll do one more. Who has one more?
I'm happy to go. I think for me, the kind of responsibility that we have as designers is to find the optimism. We don't have the luxury of cynicism. So our responsibility is to find the optimism where others see nothing but crisis and constraint.
That's wonderful. Thank you. Thank you for saying that. Okay, so it looks like we're wrapping up. We don't, oh wait, hold on. It looks like we have till 4:30. Great, we have more time, good. So that means that I believe it was, who was it that started to talk a moment ago? Was it you, Eugenia? Eugenia. Yes, you wanted to give a parting comment too. And then after you, we're going to go to the stoic-faced Kai down there in the box. He's had the serious face the whole time. But Eugenia, please, if you can share your parting message with us.
Okay, I was going to say that I think we need to give more value to public space, and it's important to be democratic, to allow people to make necessary agreements and collectively empower themselves. I think there is a lack of discussions and dialogues. And to me, democracy starts with difference. It looks like random strangers meeting, like poor and rich living together, like immigrants coming randomly, like diversity. So I think this is the message, like inclusively, as Bruce says before, and leadership and diversity.
Thank you, Eugenia. Kai.
Sure, I'll start with where I left off on my last comment of the collective. I think it is in many ways listening, bringing in the voices, and the idea that you as the designer or as the curator of those ideas, being able to sort of then find ways in which to find a collective response. And I think that that is from the very idea of how to finance a project to actually how to implement and to have the broadest support of the types of changes and sort of systemic change that we're looking for.
Good, thank you. And then I think Christopher, do you want to give us a parting comment? And actually, before we go to Christopher, we have another question here around discipline and behavior. And if Christopher, if you can kind of pick up on this and just give us a short response on this would be great. And then we could popcorn to anybody else who would like to answer. How does discipline and behavior fit in the discussion versus design with respect to density?
I'm not sure. What do you think? Can you read that question again, or give me a sense of what discipline means in that context?
How does discipline and behavior fit in discussion? So in other words, how we think about how we process, how we move forward, our ability to stick to the stick-to-itiveness, right, of a plan. So that level of discipline, and how does that fit into the design with respect to density? I think one of you, we had talked to someone, I think you had mentioned, Christopher, about density and how we design space and structures. So I guess it's really about sticking to it. Timothy, if you'd like to add more detail to that question, we'd more than welcome that as well.
That might be helpful. I will say as sort of my parting comments, my advice would be to organize at the grassroots level. And if you're a designer, figure out how you can participate in that organization at the grassroots level. I think we have a tendency in the media, and I say we because I still think of myself as a member of the media, having been a journalist and critic for so long, tend to write about things that are major shifts as if they happen overnight. And this year we have really fallen into that trap. If you look at the reckoning over racial justice, over monuments and memorials that I talked about a little bit before, if you look at changes in voting patterns in places like Georgia, places like Arizona, we tend to report on those things and sometimes analyze them and understand them as if they happen overnight. But in fact, all of those things that I just mentioned are the products of long-term grassroots community level organization. And it's those movements and groups that we need to listen to, as others have said, to empower. And as designers and architects and civic clients, we need to figure out how to amplify those voices in that work so that it might take 1 decade instead of 2 to get to those outcomes that we sometimes think of as happening overnight.
Thank you, Christopher. So it looks like Timothy has not jumped on to define that question around density.
Totally failed to answer the question, so apologies.
No, that's okay. That's okay. I think it was really about how we structure the work that we do. I think we mentioned earlier about this sort of being the hotness, right? That we're all going to go back to the behaviors that led us here, and we really need to redefine, right?
I see.
Yeah, redefine how we're looking. Okay, here we go. Some cities mentioned having fewer COVID-19 issues may have a more communal discipline versus individualism.
I see. Yes. I think there's something to that. I don't know if I would say discipline. I might say communitarianism, a communitarian impulse. I was in Tokyo, actually, my last trip before the pandemic was in Tokyo in January, and I was really struck by mask wearing, of course, which comes out of SARS, but also there was a very easy adaptation to a kind of full commitment by the society to wear a mask. And I think we're finding more than anything else, it's really consistent mask wearing that keeps this pandemic in check. And there is a tension between that and a kind of American idea, which is maybe particularly strong in California, of individualism and this idea that we exist as individuals in the city rather than as part of a collective. But I think as many have mentioned, the response to the pandemic has really shown that people have a desire to act in a more collective and communitarian way, and that's one of the places I hope we can take some of that momentum forward.
Just because let me ask this question to the group in terms of what Christopher, how he just ended that comment around sort of the group things, the communal work, the communal discipline. Can we as a society really embark on that level of change? Can we all, because then we saw a lot of divisive conversation around something as simple as, for example, masks, depending on where you live, where you're from. I moved here about a year ago from Texas. It's a very different set of rules in Texas. So when we talk about sort of those design elements that are communal in nature, that bring people together, but at the same time, we have to start thinking about how we also keep them apart. Are we going to be able to straddle that? Are we going to be able to create sort of that safe space for everybody, but still bring us together? Does that make sense?
I'm skeptical.
Because we see it. You're skeptical. Okay.
I'm skeptical, right? And we sort of imagine the world as, one big city. I think, we can't unfortunately agree on a shared set of facts. So it's sort of hard to even then conceptualize the problems that we're trying to address, because we can't even all agree whether or not there are problems, right? And I was sort of struck reading about a nurse who's treating patients infected with COVID-19 and literally having her patients on their deathbed from COVID-19 tell her that they don't have COVID-19 and that it's a hoax. And so, that level of infidelity to the truth, I think, is something that anyone who sort of thinks about collective solutions to problems is going to have to, really, really sort of take into mind, because I think the first step is going to be getting people to agree on the facts and getting people to agree on truth as the sort of initial preface to moving people forward towards collective action.
Mm-hmm. That's a good point. Thank you for sharing that, Julius. Go ahead, Bruce.
I was just going to say, if you think about what we've accomplished over the last 200 years in terms of confronting the great challenges of humanity and doing it collectively. I mean, if you look at almost all the important metrics and the sustainable development goals, these are all efforts that are global efforts to confront the greatest challenges in human history. And we have wildly succeeded. It's the reason that we're 7.8 billion people. It's the reason that there are people every day working, as there are on this call, people from different languages, cultures, countries, experiences, disciplines, crossing boundaries and collaborating to solve problems and make the world a better place. I think we have to get back to that dominant narrative of our time. That's who we really are. We are not the stupid conflict and lying and cheating and those kinds of things are the margin. That's not who we are. It's who we can be, but it's not predominantly who we are. And I think we really have to reassert who we really are. And that caring is, in fact, the central, most important fact of our time.
Good point. Thank you so much for sharing that, Bruce. And it's funny, as you say that, I think back to the slides that Kai had shown in his opening remarks around how we've taken, I think it was an image of cholera and what was it, Central Park, right? There was a picture of World War II, I believe, and sort of the highway system. So what are our thoughts around how we've basically taken, how we can take what is happening here and create structures and spaces and accessibility to certain things as a result of what we're experiencing with this pandemic? So how is this, I guess in summary, how is this pandemic, how can it transform into something that has a benefit for the greater good when we look at space?
Future CTBUH conferences will show us exactly what we will actually experience. And what I would like to, CTBUH is interesting because it's a council of tall buildings, but more important, urban habitat. And I think that we cannot think about density and building taller and taller buildings without actually integrating the urban habitat and finding ways in which development and the future and progress and all of these things that we are a part of actually manifest themselves. And that's, I think, where the learnings that we're going to find and that we are being challenged to find will manifest themselves.
Good point. I like the concept of thinking about the future sessions like this and how great predictors we are going to be as we look forward. Okay, we are down to our actual, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Tatiana had, I think, one final thought.
Absolutely, Tatiana.
No, I just wanted to add that I think that to understand the collectivity and to really arrive to a place where the collectivity can agree, it needs to be staged in scales. As a 15-minute city that it's so popular right now, I would say the 15-minute, which it doesn't relate because it's not about time, people, no? And so how can we really, we cannot agree as individuals within the huge collective, but we can agree if we are these individuals creating a small group of people, neighbors, and then, or constituents, or however you want to call them, and then of 50 people, and then a group that can agree on of 100 people on other things. And this way we stage also the relationships we can get to finally understand what is about the collective that can help us.
Thank you, Tatiana, for sharing that. So we are going to begin to wrap up this session. Thank you so much to all of our fantastic and humble and brilliant panelists for being here with us today. So we're bringing this section to a close, and we're also concluding the 2020 CTBUH virtual conference. So we were sort of the pièce de résistance to this afternoon. 21 hours of programming that took us from Singapore to London and now here in Chicago. Please remember that any sessions that you aren't able to join live will be available as on-demand recordings within the next day or so. CTBUH will notify you by email when those videos are live. So thank you again to all of you, Julius, Christopher, Eugenia, Bruce, Kai, and Tatiana for being with us today. So have a great evening and be safe and be well.
Thank you so much, Judith.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you, everyone.